Before they went to sleep, Moraine knelt by each in turn and laid her hands on their heads. Lan grumbled that he had no need and she should not waste her strength, but he did not try to stop her. Egwene was eager for the experience, Mat and Perrin clearly frightened of it, and frightened to say no. Tom jerked away from the Aes Sedai's hands, but she seized his grey head with a look that allowed no nonsense. The gleeman scowled through the entire thing. She smiled mockingly once she took her hands away. His frown deepened, but he did look refreshed. They all did. Rand had drawn back into a niche in the uneven wall where he hoped he would be overlooked. His eyes wanted to slide closed once he leaned back against the timber jumble, but he forced himself to watch. He pushed a fist against his mouth to stifle a yawn. A little sleep, an hour or two, and he would be just fine. Moraine did not forget him, though. He flinched at the coolness of her fingers on his face and said, "I don't..." His eyes widened in wonder. Tiredness drained out of him like water running downhill. Aches and soreness ebbed to dim memories and vanished. He stared at her with his mouth hanging open. She only smiled and withdrew her hands. "It is done," she said, and as she stood with a weary sigh, he was reminded that she could not do the same for herself. Indeed, she only drank a little tea, refusing the bread and cheese Lan tried to press on her, before curling up beside the fire. She seemed to fall asleep the instant she wrapped her cloak around her. The others, all save Lan, were dropping asleep wherever they could find a space to stretch out, but Rand could not imagine why. He felt as if he had already had a full night in a good bed. No sooner did he lean back against the log wall, though, than sleep rolled him under. When Lan poked him awake an hour later, he felt as though he had had 3 days' rest. The warder awakened them all, except Moraine, and he sternly hushed any sound that might disturb her. Even so, he allowed them only a short stay in the snug cave of trees. Before the sun was twice its own height above the horizon, all traces that anyone had ever stopped there had been cleared away, and they were all mounted and moving north towards Baerlon, riding slowly to conserve the horses. The Aes Sedai's eyes were shadowed, but she sat her saddle upright and steady. Fog still hung thick over the river behind them, a grey wall resisting the efforts of the feeble sun to burn it away and hiding the two rivers from view. Rand watched over his shoulder as he rode, hoping for one last glimpse, even of Taran Ferry, until the fog bank was lost to sight. "I never thought I'd ever be this far from home," he said, when the trees at last hid both the fog and the river. "Remember when Watch Hill seemed a long way? 2 days ago, that was. It seems like forever." "In a month or two, we'll be back," Perrin said in a strained voice. "Think what we'll have to tell." "Even Trollocs can't chase us forever," Mat said. "Burn me, they can't." He straightened around with a heavy sigh, slumping in his saddle as if he did not believe a word that had been said. "Men," Egwene snorted. "You get the adventure you're always prating about, and already you're talking about home." She held her head high, yet Rand noticed a tremor to her voice, now that nothing more was to be seen of the two rivers. Neither Moraine nor Lan made any attempt to reassure them, not a word to say that of course they would come back. He tried not to think on what that might mean. Even rested, he was full enough of doubts without searching out more. Hunching in his saddle, he began a waking dream of tending the sheep alongside Tam, in a pasture with deep, lush grass and larks singing of a spring morning, and a trip into Emmons Field, and Beltane the way it had been, dancing on the green with never a care beyond whether he might stumble in the steps. He managed to lose himself in it for a long time. The journey to Baerlon took almost a week. Lan muttered about the laggardness of their travel, but it was he who set the pace and forced the rest to keep it. With himself and his stallion Mandab, he said it meant blade in the old tongue, he was not so sparing. The warder covered twice as much ground as they did, galloping ahead, his color-shifting cloak swirling in the wind to scout what lay before them, or dropping behind to examine their back trail. Any others who tried to move at more than a walk, though, got cutting words on taking care of their animals, biting words on how well they would do afoot if the Trollocs did appear. Not even Moraine was proof against his tongue if she let the white mare pick up her step. Aldi, the mare was called, in the old tongue, West Wind, the wind that brought the spring rains. The warder's scouting never turned up any sign of pursuit or ambush. He spoke only to Moraine of what he saw, and that quietly so it could not be overheard, and the Aes Sedai informed the rest of them of what she thought they needed to know. In the beginning, Rand looked over his shoulder as much as he did ahead. He was not the only one. Perrin fingered his axe often, and Mat rode with an arrow nocked to his bow in the beginning. But the land behind remained empty of Trollocs or figures in black cloaks. The sky remained empty of Dragcar. Slowly, Rand began to think perhaps they really had escaped. No very great cover was to be had, even in the thickest parts of the woods. Winter clung as hard north of the Tarren as it did in the Two Rivers. Stands of pine or fir or leather leaf, and here and there a few spicewoods or laurels, dotted a forest of otherwise bare, grey branches. Not even the elders showed a leaf. Only scattered green sprigs of new growth stood out against brown meadows beaten flat by the winter's snows. Here, too, much of what did grow was stinging nettles and coarse thistle and stinkweed. On the bare dirt of the forest floor, some of the last snow still hung on, in shady patches and in drifts beneath the low branches of evergreens. Everyone kept their cloaks drawn well about them, for the thin sunlight had no warmth to it, and the night cold pierced deep. No more birds flew here than in the Two Rivers, not even ravens. There was nothing leisurely about the slowness of their movement. The North Road, Rand continued to think of it that way, though he suspected it might have a different name here north of the Tarren, still ran almost due north, but at Land's insistence their path snaked this way and that through the forest as often as it ran along the hard-packed dirt road. A village or a farm or any sign of men or civilization sent them circling for miles to avoid it, though there were few enough of any of those. The whole first day, Rand saw no evidence, aside from the road, that men had ever been in that woods. It came to him that even when he had gone to the foot of the Mountains of Mist, he might not have been as far from a human habitation as he was that day. The first farm he saw, a large frame house and tall barn with high-peaked thatch roofs, a curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney, was a shop. "It's no different from back home," Perrin said, frowning at the distant buildings barely visible through the trees. People moved around the farmyard, as yet unaware of the travelers. "Of course it is," Mat said. "We're just not close enough to see." "I tell you, it's no different," Perrin insisted. "It must be. We're north of the Tarren, after all." "Quiet, you two," Lan growled. "We don't want to be seen, remember? This way." He turned west to circle the farm through the trees. Looking back, Rand thought Perrin was right. The farm looked much the same as any around Emmons Field. There was a small boy toting water from the well, and older boys tending sheep behind a rail fence. It even had a curing shed for tobacco. But Mat was right, too. We're north of the Tarren. It must be different. Always they halted while light still clung to the sky, to choose a spot sloped for drainage and sheltered from the wind that seldom died completely, only changed direction. Their fire was always small and hidden from only a few yards off, and once tea was brewed, the flames were doused and the coals buried. At their first stop, before the sun sank, Lan began teaching the boys what to do with the weapons they carried. He started with the bow. After watching Mat put 3 arrows into a knot the size of a man's head on the fissured trunk of a dead leather leaf at 100 paces, he told the others to take their turns. Perrin duplicated Mat's feat, and Rand, summoning the flame and the void, the empty calm that let the bow become a part of him, or him of it, clustered his 3 where the points almost touched one another. Mat gave him a congratulatory clap on the shoulder. "Now, if you all had bows," the warder said dryly when they started grinning, And if the Trollocs agreed not to come so close you couldn't use them... The grins faded abruptly. Let me see what I can teach you in case they do come that close. He showed Perrin a bit of how to use that great bladed axe. Raising an axe to someone, or something, that had a weapon was not at all like chopping wood or flailing around in pretend. Setting the big apprentice blacksmith to a series of exercises, block, parry, and strike, he did the same for Rand and his sword. Not the wild leaping about and slashing that Rand had in mind whenever he thought about using it, but smooth motions, one flowing into another, almost a dance. Moving the blade is not enough, Lan said, though some think it is. The mind is part of it, most of it. Blank your mind, sheepherder. Empty it of hate, or fear, of everything. Burn them away. You others listen to this too. You can use it with the axe or the bow, with a spear or a quarterstaff, or even your bare hands. Rand stared at him. The flame and the void, he said wonderingly. That's what you mean, isn't it? My father taught me about that. The warder gave him an unreadable look in return. Hold the sword as I showed you, sheepherder. I cannot make a mud-footed villager into a blade master in an hour, but perhaps I can keep you from slicing off your own foot. Rand sighed and held the sword upright before him in both hands. Moraine watched without expression, but the next evening she told Lan to continue the lessons. The meal at evening was always the same as at midday and breakfast, flat bread and cheese and dried meat, except that evenings they had hot tea to wash it down instead of water. Tom entertained them evenings. Lan would not let the gleeman play harp or flute. No need to rouse the countryside, the warder said. But Tom juggled and told stories. Mara and the Three Foolish Kings, or one of the hundreds about Anla the Wise Counselor, or something filled with glory and adventure, like the Great Hunt of the Horn, but always with a happy ending and a joyous homecoming. Yet, if the land was peaceful around them, if no Trollocs appeared among the trees, no drag car among the clouds, it seemed to Rand that they managed to raise their tension themselves, whenever it was in danger of vanishing. There was the morning that Egwene awoke and began unbraiding her hair. Rand watched her from the corner of his eye as he made up his blanket roll. Every night, when the fire was doused, everyone took to their blankets except for Egwene and the Aes Sedai. The two women always went aside from the others and talked for an hour or two, returning when the others were asleep. Egwene combed her hair out. 100 strokes, he counted, while he was saddling Cloud, tying his saddlebags and blanket behind the saddle. Then she tucked the comb away, swept her loose hair over her shoulder, and pulled up the hood of her cloak. Startled, he asked, "What are you doing?" She gave him a sidelong look without answering. It was the first time he had spoken to her in 2 days, he realized, since the night in the log shelter on the bank of the Tarn. But he did not let that stop him. "All your life you've waited to wear your hair in a braid, and now you're giving it up? Why? Because she doesn't braid hers?" "I said I don't braid their hair," she said simply. "At least, not unless they want to." "You aren't an Aes Sedai. You're Egwene Alvear from Emond's Field, and the Women's Circle would have a fit if they could see you now. Women's Circle business is none of yours, Rand al'Thor, and I will be an Aes Sedai, just as soon as I reach Tar Valon." He snorted. "As soon as you reach Tar Valon? Why? Light, tell me that. You're no dark friend." "Do you think Moraine Sedai is a dark friend? Do you?" She squared around to face him with her fists clenched, and he almost thought she was going to hit him. "After she saved the village? After she saved your father?" "I don't know what she is, but whatever she is, it doesn't say anything about the rest of them. The stories..." "Grow up, Rand! Forget the stories and use your eyes!" "My eyes saw her sink the ferry. Deny that. Once you get an idea in your head, you won't budge even if somebody points out you're trying to stand on water. If you weren't such a light-blinded fool, you'd see..." "Fool, am I? Let me tell you a thing or two, Rand al'Thor. You are the muliest, most wool-headed..." "You two trying to wake everybody inside 10 miles?" the warder asked. Standing there with his mouth open, trying to get a word in edgeways, Rand suddenly realized he had been shouting. They both had. Egwene's face went scarlet to her eyebrows, and she spun away with a muttered, "Men!" that seemed as much for the warder as for him. Warily, Rand looked around the camp. Everybody was looking at him, not just the warder. Matt and Perrin, with their faces white. Tom, tensed as if ready to run or fight. Moraine. The Aes Sedai's face was expressionless, but her eyes seemed to bore into his head. Desperately, he tried to recall exactly what he had said about Aes Sedai and dark friends. "It is time to be going," Moraine said. She turned to Aldib, and Rand shivered as if he had been let out of a trap. He wondered if he had been. 2 nights later, with the fire burning low, Matt licked the last crumbs of cheese from his fingers and said, "You know, I think we've lost them for good." Lan was off in the night, taking a last look around. Moraine and Egwene had gone aside for one of their conversations. Tom was half dozing over his pipe, and the young men had the fire to themselves. Perrin, idly poking the embers with a stick, answered, "If we've lost them, why does Lan keep scouting?" Nearly asleep, Rand rolled over, his back to the fire. "We lost them back at Tarim Ferry." Matt lay back with his fingers laced behind his head, staring at the moon-filled sky. "If they were even really after us." "You think the Tradcar was chasing us because it liked us?" Perrin asked. "I say stop worrying about Trollocs and such," Matt went on as if Perrin had not spoken, "and start thinking about seeing the world. We're out where the stories come from. What do you think a real city is like?" "We're going to Baerlon," Rand said sleepily, but Matt snorted. "Baerlon's all very well, but I've seen that old map Master Alvear has. If we turn south once we reach Camelin, the road leads all the way to Ilian and beyond." "What's so special about Ilian?" Perrin said, yawning. "For one thing," Matt replied, "Ilian isn't full of Aes..." A silence fell, and Rand was suddenly wide awake. Moraine had come back early. Egwene was with her, but it was the Aes Sedai standing at the edge of the firelight who held their attention. Matt lay there on his back, his mouth still open, staring at her. Moraine's eyes caught the light like dark, polished stones. Abruptly, Rand wondered how long she had been standing there. "The lads were just..." Tom began, but Moraine spoke right over the top of him. "A few days' respite and you are ready to give up?" Her calm, level voice contrasted sharply with her eyes. "A day or two of quiet, and already you have forgotten Winter Night." "We haven't forgotten," Perrin said. "It's just..." Still not raising her voice, the Aes Sedai treated him as she had the Gleeman. "Is that the way you all feel? You are all eager to run off to Ilian and forget about Trollocs and Halfmen and Dragcar?" She ran her eyes over them. That stony glint playing against the everyday tone of voice made Rand uneasy, but she gave no one a chance to speak. "The Dark One is after you 3, one or all. And if I let you go running off wherever you want to go, he will take you. Whatever the Dark One wants, I oppose. So hear this and know it true. Before I let the Dark One have you, I will destroy you myself." It was her voice, so matter-of-fact, that convinced Rand. The Aes Sedai would do exactly what she said, if she thought it was necessary. He had a hard time sleeping that night, and he was not the only one. Even the Gleeman did not begin snoring till long after the last coals died. For once, Moraine offered no help. Those nightly talks between Egwene and the Aes Sedai were a sore point for Rand. Whenever they disappeared into the darkness, aside from the rest for privacy, he wondered what they were saying, what they were doing. What was the Aes Sedai doing to Egwene? One night he waited until the other men had all settled down, Tom snoring like a saw cutting an oak knot. Then he slipped away, clutching his blanket around him. Using every bit of skill he had gained stalking rabbits, He moved with the moon shadows until he was crouched at the base of a tall leatherleaf tree, thick with tough, broad leaves, close enough to hear Moraine and Egwene, where they sat on a fallen log with a small lantern for light. "Ask," Moraine was saying, "and if I can tell you now, I will. Understand there is much for which you are not yet ready. Is there a rock so hard that wind and water cannot wear it away? A fire so strong that water cannot quench it, or wind snuff it out?" Egwene was silent for a time, digging her toe into the forest floor. They were the ones who tried to free the Dark One and the Forsaken, weren't they? The male Aes Sedai. She took a deep breath and picked up speed. The women were not part of it. It was the men who went mad and broke the world. "You are afraid," Moraine said grimly. "If you had remained in Emond's Field, you would have become wisdom in time. That was Nynaeve's plan, was it not? Or you would have sat in the women's circle and managed the affairs of Emond's Field while the village council thought it was doing so. But you did the unthinkable. You left Emond's Field, left the Two Rivers, seeking adventure. You wanted to do it, and at the same time, you are afraid of it, and you are stubbornly refusing to let your fear best you. You would not have asked me how a woman becomes an Aes Sedai otherwise. You would not have thrown custom and convention over the fence otherwise." "No," Egwene protested. "I'm not afraid. I do want to become an Aes Sedai. Better for you if you were afraid. But I hope you hold to that conviction. Few women these days have the ability to become initiates, much less have the wish to." Moraine's voice sounded as if she had begun musing to herself. Surely never before two in one village. The old blood is indeed still strong in the Two Rivers. In the shadows, Rand shifted. A twig snapped under his foot. He froze instantly, sweating and holding his breath, but neither of the women looked around. "Two?" Egwene exclaimed. "Who else? Is it Kari? Kari Thane? Lara Aiellan?" Moraine gave an exasperated click of her tongue, then said sternly, "You must forget I said that. Her road lies another way, I fear. Concern yourself with your own circumstances. It is not an easy road you have chosen." "I will not turn back," Egwene said, "be that as it may. But you still want reassurance, and I cannot give it to you. Not in the way you want. I don't understand. You want to know that Aes Sedai are good and pure. That it was those wicked men of the legends who caused the breaking of the world, not the women. Well, it was the men, but they were no more wicked than any men. They were insane, not evil. The Aes Sedai you will find in Tarvalon are human, no different from any other women except for the ability that sets us apart. They are brave and cowardly, strong and weak, kind and cruel, warm-hearted and cold. Becoming an Aes Sedai will not change you from what you are." Egwene drew a heavy breath. "I suppose I was afraid of that. That I'd be changed by the power. That and the Trollocs, and the Fade, and... Moraine Sedai, in the name of the light, why did the Trollocs come to Emond's Field?" The Aes Sedai's head swung, and she looked straight at Rand's hiding place. His breath seized in his throat. Her eyes were as hard as when she had threatened them, and he had the feeling they could penetrate the leatherleaf's thick branches. Light, what will she do if she finds me listening? He tried to melt back into the deeper shadows. With his eyes on the women, a root snagged his foot, and he barely caught himself from tumbling into dead brush that would have pointed him out with a crackle of snapping branches like fireworks. Panting, he scrambled away on all fours, keeping silent as much by luck as by anything he did. His heart pounded so hard he thought that might give him away itself. Fool, eavesdropping on an Aes Sedai. Back where the others were sleeping, he managed to slip in among them silently. Lan moved as he dropped to the ground and jerked his blanket up, but the warder settled back with a sigh. He had only been rolling over in his sleep. Rand let out a long, silent breath. A moment later, Moraine appeared out of the night, stopping where she could study the slumbering shapes. Moonlight made a nimbus around her. Rand closed his eyes and breathed evenly, all the while listening hard for footsteps coming closer. None did. When he opened his eyes again, she was gone. When finally sleep came, it was fitful and filled with sweaty dreams, where all the men in Emond's Field claimed to be the dragon reborn, and all the women had blue stones in their hair like the one Moraine wore. He did not try to overhear Moraine and Egwene again. On into the 6th day the slow journey stretched. The warmthless sun slid slowly towards the treetops, while a handful of thin clouds drifted high to the north. The wind gusted higher for a moment, and Rand pulled his cloak back up onto his shoulders, muttering to himself. He wondered if they would ever get to Baerlon. The distance they had travelled from the river already was more than enough to take him from Tarren Ferry to the White River, but Lan always said it was just a short journey, whenever he was asked, hardly worth calling a journey at all. It made him feel lost. Lan appeared ahead of them in the woods, returning from one of his forays. He reined in and rode beside Moraine, his head bent close to hers. Rand grimaced, but he did not ask any questions. Lan simply refused to acknowledge all such questions aimed at him. Only Egwene among the others even appeared to notice Lan's return, so used to this arrangement had they become, and she kept back too. The Aes Sedai might have begun acting as if Egwene were in charge of the Emond's Fielders, but that gave her no say when the warder made his reports. Perrin was carrying Mat's bow, wrapped in a thoughtful silence that seemed to take them all more and more as they got further from the two rivers. The horse's slow walk allowed Mat to practice juggling 3 small stones under Tom Merrilin's watchful eye. The gleeman had given lessons each night too, as well as Lan. Lan finished whatever he had been telling Moraine, and she twisted in her saddle to look back at the others. Rand tried not to stiffen when her eyes moved across him. Did they linger on him a moment longer than on anyone else? He had the queasy feeling that she knew who had been listening in the darkness that night. "Hey, Rand!" Mat called. "I can juggle 4." Rand waved in reply without looking around. "I told you I'd get to 4 before you. Look!" They had topped a low hill, and below them, a scant mile away through the stark trees and the stretching shadows of evening, lay Baerlon. Rand gasped, trying to smile and gape at the same time. A log wall, nearly 20 feet tall, surrounded the town, with wooden watchtowers scattered along its length. Within, rooftops of slate and tile glinted with the sinking sun, and feathers of smoke drifted upward from chimneys. Hundreds of chimneys. There was not a thatched roof to be seen. A broad road ran east from the town and another west, each with at least a dozen wagons and twice as many ox carts trudging towards the palisade. Farms lay scattered about the town, thickest to the north, while only a few broke the forest to the south, but they might as well not have existed so far as Rand was concerned. It's bigger than Emond's Field and Watch Hill and Devon Ride all put together. And maybe Tarren Ferry too. So that's a city, Mat breathed, leaning forward across his horse's neck to stare. Perrin could only shake his head. How can so many people live in one place? Egwene simply stared. Tom Merrilin glanced at Mat, then rolled his eyes and blew out his moustaches. "City," he snorted. "And you, Rand?" Moraine said. "What do you think of your first sight of Baerlon?" "I think it's a long way from home," he said slowly, bringing a sharp laugh from Mat. "You have further to go yet," Moraine said. "Much further. But there is no other choice except to run and hide and run again for the rest of your lives. And short lives they would be. You must remember that when the journey becomes hard. You have no choice." Rand exchanged glances with Mat and Perrin. By their faces, they were thinking the same thing he was. How could she talk as if they had any choice after what she had said? The Aes Sedai's made our choices. Moraine went on as if their thoughts were not plain. The danger begins again here. Watch what you say within those walls. Above all, do not mention Trollocs, or half-men, or any such. You must not even think of the Dark One. Some in Berlon have even less love for Aes Sedai than do the people of Emond's Field, and there may even be dark friends. Egwene gasped, and Perrin muttered under his breath. Mat's face paled, but Moraine went on calmly. We must attract as little attention as possible. Lan was exchanging his cloak of shifting greys and greens for one of dark brown, more ordinary, though of fine cut and weave. His color-changing cloak made a large bulge in one of his saddlebags. We do not go by our own names here, Moraine continued. Here, I am known as Alice, and Lan is Andra. Remember that? Good. Let us be within the walls before night catches us. The gates of Berlon are closed from sundown to sunrise. Lan led the way down the hill and through the woods toward the log wall. The road passed half a dozen farms. None lay close, and none of the people finishing their chores seemed to notice the travelers, ending at heavy wooden gates bound with wide straps of black iron. They were closed tight, even if the sun was not down yet. Lan rode close to the wall and gave a tug to a frayed rope hanging down beside the gates. A bell clanged on the other side of the wall. Abruptly, a wizened face under a battered cloth cap peered down suspiciously from atop the wall, glaring between the cut-off ends of two of the logs, a good 3 spans over their heads. What's all this, eh? It's too late in the day to be opening this gate. Too late, I say. Go around to the Whitebridge gate if you want to. Moraine's mare moved out to where the man atop the wall had a clear view of her. Suddenly, his wrinkles deepened in a gap-toothed smile, and he seemed to quiver between speaking and doing his duty. I didn't know it was you, mistress. Wait, I'll be right down. Just wait. I'm coming. The head dipped out of sight, but Rand could still hear muffled shouts for them to stay where they were, that he was coming. With great creaks of disuse, the right-hand gate slowly swung outward. It stopped when opened just wide enough for one horse to pass through at a time, and the gatekeeper poked his head into the gap, flashed his half-toothless smile at them again, and darted back out of the way. Moraine followed Lan through, with Egwene right behind her. Rand trotted Cloud after Bella and found himself in a narrow street fronted by high wooden fences and warehouses, tall and windowless, broad doors closed up tight. Moraine and Lan were already on foot, speaking to the wrinkled-faced gatekeeper, so Rand dismounted too. The little man, in a much-mended cloak and coat, held his cloth cap crumpled in one hand and ducked his head whenever he spoke. He peered at those dismounting behind Lan and Moraine and shook his head. Down country folk, he grinned. Why, Mistress Alice, you taken up collecting down country folk with hay in their hair? His look took in Tom Merrilin then. You ain't a sheep farmer. I remember letting you go through some days back, I do. Didn't like your tricks down country, hey, Gleeman? I hope you remembered to forget letting us through, Master Arvin, Lan said, pressing a coin into the man's free hand. And letting us back in, too. No need for that, Master Andra. No need for that. You gave me plenty when you went out. Plenty. Just the same, Arvin made the coin disappear as deftly as if he were a Gleeman, too. I ain't told nobody, and I won't, neither. Especially not them white cloaks. He finished with a scowl. He pursed up his lips to spit, then glanced at Moraine and swallowed instead. Rand blinked, but kept his mouth shut. The others did too, though it appeared to be an effort for Mat. Children of the Light, Rand thought wonderingly. Stories told about the children by peddlers and merchants' guards varied from admiration to hatred, but all agreed the children hated Aes Sedai as much as they did Dark Friends. He wondered if this was more trouble already. The children are in Berlon? Lan demanded. They surely are. The gatekeeper bobbed his head. Came the same day you left, as I recall.
Ain't nobody here likes them at all. Most don't let on, of course.
Have they said why they are here? Moraine asked intently.
Why they're here, mistress?
Arvin was so astonished he forgot to duck his head.
Of course they said why. Oh, I forgot. You've been down country. Likely you ain't heard nothing but sheep bleating. They say they're here because of what's going on down in Gaeldon. The dragon, you know. Well, him as calls himself dragon. They say the fellow's stirring up evil, which I expect he is, and they're here to stamp it out. Only he's down there in Gaeldon, not here. Just an excuse to meddle in other people's business is what I figure. There's already been the dragon's fang on some people's doors.
This time he did spit. Have they caused much trouble then? Lan said, and Arvin shook his head vigorously.
Not that they don't want to, I expect, only the governor don't trust them no more than I do. He won't let but maybe 10 or so inside the walls at one time, and ain't they mad about that? The rest have a camp a little ways north, I hear. Bet they got the farmers looking over their shoulders. The ones that do come in, they just stalk around in those white cloaks, looking down their noses at honest folk. Walk in the light, they say, and it's an order. Ne'er come to blows more than once with the wagoneers and miners and smelters and all, and even the watch. But the governor wants it all peaceful, and that's how it's been so far. If they're hunting evil, I say, why aren't they up in Saldea? There's some kind of trouble up there, I hear, or down in Gaeldon. There's been a big battle down there, they say, real big.
Moraine drew a soft breath. I had heard that Aes Sedai were going to Gaeldon.
Yes, they did, mistress.
Arvin's head started bobbing again.
They went to Gaeldon, all right, and that's what started this battle, or so I hear. They say some of those Aes Sedai are dead. Maybe all of them. I know some folks don't hold with Aes Sedai, but I say, who else is going to stop a false dragon, eh? And those damn fools who think they can be men Aes Sedai or some such, what about them? Of course, some say, not the white cloaks, mind, and not me, but some folks, that maybe this fellow really is the dragon reborn. He can do things, I hear. He used the one power. There's thousands following him.
Don't be a fool, Lan snapped, and Arvin's face folded into a hurt look.
I'm only saying what I heard, ain't I? Just what I heard, Master Andra. They say, some do, that he's moving his army east and south toward Tyr.
His voice became heavy with meaning.
They say he's named them the People of the Dragon.
Names mean little, Moraine said calmly. If anything she had heard disturbed her, she gave no outward sign of it now. You could call your mule People of the Dragon, if you wanted.
Oh, not likely, mistress, Arvin chuckled. Not with the white cloaks around, for sure. I don't expect anybody else would look kindly on a name like that, neither. I see what you mean, but oh, no, mistress, not my mule.
No doubt a wise decision, Moraine said. Now, we must be off.
And don't you worry, mistress,
Arvin said with a deep bob of his head.
I ain't seen nobody.
He darted to the gate and began tugging it closed with quick jerks.
Ain't seen nobody and ain't seen nothing.
The gate thudded shut, and he pulled down the locking bar with a rope.
In fact, mistress, this gate ain't been open in days.
Tom, what was all that about Tyr and the People of the Dragon? Tyr is a city all the way down on the Sea of Storms, isn't it?
The Coriathan cycle,
Tom said curtly. Rand blinked. The prophecies of the dragon.
Nobody tells those stories in the Two Rivers. Not in Emond's Field, anyway. The wisdom would skin them alive if they did.
I suppose she would at that, Tom said dryly. He glanced at Moraine up ahead with Lan, saw she could not overhear, and went on. Tyr is the greatest port on the Sea of Storms, and the Stone of Tyr is the fortress that guards it. The stone is said to be the first fortress built after the breaking of the world, and in all this time it has never fallen, though more than one army has tried. One of the prophecies says that the Stone of Tyr will never fall until the People of the Dragon come to the stone. Another says the stone will never fall till the sword that cannot be touched is wielded by the dragon's hand. Tom grimaced. The fall of the stone
will be one of the major proofs that the dragon has been reborn. May the stone stand till I am dust. The sword that cannot be touched? That's what it says. I don't know whether it is a sword. Whatever it is, it lies in the heart of the stone, the central citadel of the fortress. None but the High Lords of Tyr can enter there, and they never speak of what lies inside. Certainly not to Gleeman, anyway. Rand frowned. The stone cannot fall until the dragon wields the sword, but how can he, unless the stone has already fallen? Is the dragon supposed to be a High Lord of Tyr? Not much chance of that, the Gleeman said dryly. Tyr hates anything to do with the power, even more than Amador, and Amador is the stronghold of the Children of the Light. Then how can the prophecy be fulfilled? Rand asked. I'd like it well enough if the dragon was never reborn, but a prophecy that cannot be fulfilled doesn't make much sense. It sounds like a story meant to make people think the dragon never will be reborn. Is that it? You ask an awful lot of questions, boy, Tom said. A prophecy that was easily fulfilled would not be worth much now, would it? Suddenly his voice brightened. Well, we're here. Wherever here is. Lan motioned the others to follow and brought up the rear, closing the gate behind him. On the other side of the fence, Rand found himself in the stable yard of an inn. A loud bustle and clatter came from the building's kitchen, but what struck him was its size. It covered more than twice as much ground as the Winespring Inn, and was 4 stories high besides. Well over half the windows were aglow in the deepening twilight. He wondered at this city that could have so many strangers in it. No sooner had they come well into the stable yard than 3 men in dirty canvas aprons appeared at the huge stable's broad arched doors. One, a wiry fellow and the only one without a manure fork in his hands, came forward waving his arms. Here, here, you can't come in that way. You'll have to go round the front. Lan's hand went to his purse again, but even as it did, another man, as big around as Master Alvia, came hurrying out of the inn. Puffs of hair stuck out above his ears, and his sparkling white apron was as good as a sign proclaiming him the innkeeper. It's all right, Much, the newcomer said. It's all right. These folk are expected guests. Take care of their horses now. Good care. Much sullenly knuckled his forehead, then motioned his 2 companions to come help. Rand and the others hurriedly got their saddlebags and blanket rolls down, while the innkeeper turned to Moraine. He gave her a deep bow and spoke with a genuine smile. Welcome, Mistress Alice, welcome. It's good to be seeing you. You and Master Andra both. Very good. Your fine conversation has been missed. Yes, it has. I must say I worried, you going down country and all. Well, I mean, at a time like this, with the weather all crazy and wolves howling right up to the walls in the night. Abruptly, he slapped both hands against his round belly and shook his head. Here I go on like this, chattering away, instead of taking you inside. Come, come, hot meals and warm beds, that's what you'll be wanting. And the best in Berlon are right here, the very best. And hot baths too, I trust, Master Fitch, Moraine said, and Egwene echoed her fervently. Oh, yes. Baths? The innkeeper said. Why, just the best and hottest in Berlon. Come. Welcome to the Stag and Lion. Welcome to Berlon. Chapter 14. The Stag and Lion. Inside, the inn was every bit as busy as the sounds coming from it had indicated, and more. The party from Emmons Field followed Master Fitch through the back door, soon weaving around and between a constant stream of men and women in long aprons, platters of food and trays of drink held high. The bearers murmured quick apologies when they got in anyone's way, but they never slowed by a step. One of the men took hurried orders from Master Fitch and disappeared at a run. The inn is near full, I'm afraid, the innkeeper told Moraine. Almost to the rafters. Every inn in town is the same. With the winter we just had, well, as soon as it cleared enough for them to get down out of the mountains, we were inundated. Yes, that's the word. Inundated by men from the mines and smelters, all telling the most horrible tales. Wolves and worse. The kind of tales men tell when they've been cooped up all winter. I can't think there's anyone left up there at all. We have that many here. But never fear. Things may be a little crowded, but I'll do my best by you and Master Andra. And your friends too, of course. He glanced curiously once or twice at Rand and the others. Except for Tom, their clothes named them country folk, and Tom's gleeman's cloak made him a strange travelling companion as well, for Mistress Alice and Master Andra. I will do my best, you may rest assured. Rand stared at the bustle around them and tried to avoid being stepped on, though none of the help really seemed to be in any danger of that. He kept thinking of how Master Alvear and his wife tended the Winespring Inn, with sometimes a little assistance from their daughters. Matt and Perrin craned their necks in interest towards the common room, from which rolled a wave of laughter and singing and jovial shouting whenever the wide door at the end of the hall swung open. Muttering about finding out the news, the warder grimly disappeared through that swinging door, swallowed by a wave of merriment. Rand wanted to follow him, but he wanted a bath even more. He could have done with people and laughing right then, but the common room would appreciate his presence more when he was clean. Matt and Perrin apparently felt the same. Matt was scratching surreptitiously. Master Fitch, Moraine said, I understand there are children of the light in Berlin. Is there likely to be trouble? Oh, never you worry about them, Mistress Alice. They're up to their usual tricks. Claim there's an Aes Sedai in the town. Moraine lifted an eyebrow, and the innkeeper spread his plump hands. Don't you worry. They've tried it before. There's no Aes Sedai in Berlin, and the governor knows it. The White Cloaks think if they show an Aes Sedai, some woman they claim is an Aes Sedai, people will let all of them inside the walls. Well, I suppose some would. Some would. But most people know what the White Cloaks are up to, and they support the governor. No one wants to see some harmless old woman hurt just so the children can have an excuse for whipping up a frenzy. I'm glad to hear it, Moraine said dryly. She put a hand on the innkeeper's arm. Is Min still here? I wish to talk with her if she is. Master Fitch's answer was lost to Rand in the arrival of attendants to lead them to the baths. Moraine and Egwene vanished behind a plump woman with a ready smile and an armload of towels. The gleeman and Rand and his friends found themselves following a slight dark-haired fellow, Ara by name. Rand tried asking Ara about Berlin, but the man barely said 2 words together, except to say Rand had a funny accent, and then the first sight of the bath chamber drove all thoughts of talk right out of Rand's head. A dozen tall copper bathtubs sat in a circle on the tiled floor, which sloped down slightly to a drain in the center of the big stone-walled room. A thick towel neatly folded and a large cake of yellow soap sat on a stool behind each tub, and big black iron cauldrons of water stood heating over fires along one wall. On the opposite wall, logs blazing in a deep fireplace added to the general warmth. Almost as good as the Winespring Inn back home, Perrin said loyally, if not exactly with a great attention to truth. Tom barked a laugh, and Matt sniggered. Sounds like we brought a Copling with us and didn't know it. Rand shrugged out of his cloak and stripped off his clothes while Ara filled 4 of the copper tubs. None of the others was far behind Rand in choosing a bathtub. Once their clothes were all in piles on the stools, Ara brought them each a large bucket of hot water and a dipper. That done, he sat on a stool by the door, leaning back against the wall with his arms crossed, apparently lost in his own thoughts. There was little in the way of conversation while they lathered and sluiced away a week of grime with dippers of steaming water. Then it was into the tubs for a long soak. Ara had made the water hot enough that settling in was a slow process of luxuriant sighs. The air in the room went from warm to misty and hot. For a long time there was no sound except the occasional long, relaxing exhalation as tight muscles loosened, and a chill that they had come to think permanent was drawn out of their bones. Need anything else? Ara asked suddenly. He did not have much room to talk about people's accents. He and Master Fitch both sounded as if they had a mouthful of mush. More towels? More hot water? Nothing, Tom said in his reverberant voice. Eyes closed, he gave an indolent wave of his hand. Go and enjoy the evening. At a later time I will see that you receive more than adequate recompense for your services. He settled lower in the tub until the water covered everything but his eyes and nose.
Ara's eyes went to the stools behind the tubs, where their clothes and belongings were stacked. He glanced at the bow, but lingered longest over Rand's sword and Perrin's axe.
"Is there trouble down country too?"
he said abruptly.
"In the rivers, or whatever you call it?"
"The two rivers," Matt said, pronouncing each separate word distinctly. "It's the two rivers. As for trouble, why—" "What do you mean, two?" Rand asked. "Is there some kind of trouble here?" Perrin, enjoying his soak, murmured, "Oh, good. Good." Tom raised himself back up a little and opened his eyes.
"Here?"
Ara snorted.
"Trouble? Miners having fistfights in the street in the dark of the morning aren't trouble. Or—"
He stopped and eyed them a moment.
"I meant the Gaelden kind of trouble,"
he said finally.
"No, I suppose not. Nothing but sheep down country, is there? No offence. I just meant it's quiet down there. Still, it's been a strange winter. Strange things in the mountains. I heard the other day there were Trollocs up in Saldea. That's the borderlands then, isn't it?"
He finished with his mouth still open, then snapped it shut, appearing surprised that he had said so much. Rand had tensed at the word Trollocs, and tried to hide it by wringing his washcloth out over his head. As the fellow went on, he relaxed, but not everyone kept his mouth shut.
"Trollocs?"
Matt chortled. Rand splashed water at him, but Matt just wiped it off his face with a grin.
"You just let me tell you about Trollocs."
For the first time since climbing into his tub, Tom spoke.
"Why don't you not? I'm a little tired of hearing my own stories back from you."
"He's a gleeman," Perrin said, and Ara gave him a scornful look.
"I saw the cloak. You going to perform?"
"Just a minute," Matt protested. "What's this about me telling Tom stories? Are you all—" "You just don't tell them as well as Tom." Rand cut him off hastily, and Perrin hopped in. "You keep adding in things, trying to make it better, and they never do. And you get it all mixed up, too," Rand added. "Best leave it to Tom." They were all talking so fast that Ara stared at them with his mouth hanging open. Matt stared too, as if everyone else had suddenly gone crazy. Rand wondered how to shut him up, short of jumping on him. The door banged open to admit Lan, brown cloak slung over one shoulder, along with a gust of cooler air that momentarily thinned the mist.
"Well,"
the warder said, rubbing his hands.
"This is what I have been waiting for."
Ara picked up a bucket, but Lan waved it away.
"No, I will see it myself."
Dropping his cloak on one of the stools, he bundled the bath attendant out of the room, despite the fellow's protests, and shut the door firmly after him. He waited there a moment, his head cocked to listen, and when he turned back to the rest of them, his voice was stony, and his eyes stabbed at Matt.
"It's a good thing I got back when I did, farm boy. Don't you listen to what you're told."
"I didn't do anything," Matt protested. "I was just going to tell him about the Trollocs, not about—" He stopped and leaned back from the warder's eyes, flat against the back of the tub. "Don't talk about Trollocs," Lan said grimly. "Don't even think about Trollocs." With an angry snort, he began filling himself a bathtub.
"Blood and ashes. You had better remember, the Dark One has eyes and ears where you least expect. And if the Children of the Light heard Trollocs were after you, they'd be burning to get their hands on you. To them, it would be as much as naming you Dark Friend. It may not be what you are used to, but until we get where we are going, keep your trust small unless Mistress Alice or I tell you differently." At his emphasis on the name Moraine was using, Matt flinched. "There was something that fellow wouldn't tell us," Rand said. "Something he thought was trouble, but he wouldn't say what it was." "Probably the children," Lan said, pouring more hot water into his tub. "Most people consider them trouble. Some don't, though. And he did not know you well enough to risk it. You might have gone running to the White Cloaks for all he knew." Rand shook his head. This place already sounded worse than Taran Ferry could possibly be. "He said there were Trollocs in Saldea, wasn't it?" Perrin said. Lan hurled his empty bucket to the floor with a crash. "You will talk about it, won't you? There are always Trollocs in the borderlands, Blacksmith. Just you put it in the front of your mind that we want no more attention than mice in a field. Concentrate on that. Moraine wants to get you all to Tarvalon alive, and I will do it if it can be done. But if you bring any harm to her..."
The rest of their bathing was done in silence, and dressing afterwards too. When they left the bath chamber, Moraine was standing at the end of the hall with a slender girl not much taller than herself. At least, Rand thought it was a girl, though her dark hair was cut short and she wore a man's shirt and trousers. Moraine said something, and the girl looked at the men sharply, then nodded to Moraine and hurried away. "Well now," Moraine said as they drew closer, "I am sure a bath has given you all an appetite. Master Fitch has given us a private dining room." She talked on inconsequentially as she turned to lead the way, about their rooms and the crowding in the town, and how the innkeeper hoped Tom would favour the common room with some music and a story or two. She never mentioned the girl, if girl it had been. The private dining room had a polished oak table with a dozen chairs around it and a thick rug on the floor. As they entered, Egwene, freshly gleaming hair combed out around her shoulders, turned from warming her hands at the fire crackling on the hearth. Rand had had plenty of time for thought during the long silence in the bath chamber. Lan's constant admonitions not to trust anyone, and especially Ara being afraid to trust them, had made him think of just how alone they really were. It seemed they could not trust anyone but themselves, and he was still not too sure how far they could trust Moraine, or Lan. Just themselves. And Egwene was still Egwene. Moraine said it would have happened to her anyway, this touching the true source. She had no control over it, and that meant it was not her fault. And she was still Egwene. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Egwene stiffened and turned her back before he could get a word out. Staring sullenly at her back, he swallowed what he had been going to say. "All right then, if she wants to be like that, there's nothing I can do." Master Fitch bustled in then, followed by 4 women in white aprons as long as his, with a platter holding 3 roast chickens and others bearing silver and pottery dishes and covered bowls. The women began setting the table immediately, while the innkeeper bowed to Moraine.
"My apologies, Mistress Alice, for making you wait like this, but with so many people at the inn, it's a wonder anybody gets served at all. I'm afraid the food isn't what it should be either. Just the chickens and some turnips and hen peas with a little cheese for after. No, it just isn't what it should be. I truly do apologize."
"A feast," Moraine smiled. "For these troubled times, a feast indeed, Master Fitch." The innkeeper bowed again. His wispy hair, sticking out in all directions as if he constantly ran his hands through it, made the bow comical, but his grin was so pleasant that anyone who laughed would be laughing with him, not at him.
"My thanks, Mistress Alice. My thanks."
As he straightened, he frowned and wiped an imagined bit of dust from the table with a corner of his apron.
"It isn't what I would have laid before you a year ago, of course. Not nearly. The winter. Yes, the winter. My cellars are emptying out, and the market is all but bare. And who can blame the farm folk? Who? There's certainly no telling when they'll harvest another crop. No telling at all. It's the wolves get the mutton and beef that should go on people's tables." And abruptly he seemed to realize that this was hardly the conversation to settle his guests to a comfortable meal. "How I do run on. Full of old wind. That's me. Old wind. Mary, Cinda, let these good people eat in peace."
He made shooing gestures at the women, and as they scurried from the room, swung back to bow to Moraine yet again.
"I hope you enjoy your meal, Mistress Alice. If there's anything else you need, just speak it, and I will fetch it. Just you speak it. It is a pleasure serving you and Master Andra. A pleasure."
He gave one more deep bow and was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Lan had slouched against the wall through all of this, as if half asleep. Now he leaped up and was at the door in 2 long strides. Pressing an ear to a door panel, he listened intently for a slow count of 30, then snatched open the door and stuck his head into the hall.
"They're gone,"
he said at last, closing the door.
"We can talk safely."
"I know you say not to trust anyone," Egwene said. "But if you suspect the innkeeper, why stay here?"
"I suspect him no more than anyone else," Lan replied. But then, until we reach Tarvalon, I suspect everyone. There, I'll suspect only half. Rand started to smile, thinking the warder was making a joke. Then he realized there was not a trace of humor on Lan's face. He really would suspect people in Tarvalon. Was anywhere safe? He exaggerates, Moraine told them soothingly. Master Fitch is a good man, honest and trustworthy. But he does like to talk, and with the best will in the world he might let something slip to the wrong ear. And I have never yet stopped at an inn where half the maids did not listen at doors and spend more time gossiping than making beds. Come, let us be seated before our meal gets cold. They took places around the table, with Moraine at the head and Lan at the foot, and for a while everyone was too busy filling their plates for talk. It might not have been a feast, but after close to a week of flatbread and dried meat, it tasted like one. After a time, Moraine asked, "What did you learn in the common room?" Knives and forks stilled, suspended in midair, and all eyes turned to the warder. "Little that's good," Lan replied. "Arvin was right, at least as far as talk has it. There was a battle in Gaelden, and Loghain was the victor. A dozen different stories are floating about, but they all agree on that." Loghain? That must be the false dragon. It was the first time Rand had heard a name put to the man. Lan sounded almost as if he knew him. "The Aes Sedai?" Moraine asked quietly, and Lan shook his head. "I don't know. Some say they were all killed. Some say none." He snorted. "Some even say they went over to Loghain. There's nothing reliable. And I did not care to show too much interest." "Yes," Moraine said. "Little that is good." With a deep breath, she brought her attention back to the table. "And what of our own circumstances?" "There, the news is better. No odd happenings, no strangers around who might be Murdral, certainly no Trollocs. And the White Cloaks are busy trying to make trouble for Governor Arden because he won't cooperate with them. They will not even notice us unless we advertise ourselves." "Good," Moraine said. "That agrees with what the bathmaid said. Gossip does have its points. Now," she addressed the entire company, "we have a long journey still ahead of us, but the last week has not been easy either, so I propose to remain here tonight and tomorrow night, and leave early the following morning." All the younger folk grinned. A city for the first time. Moraine smiled, but she still said, "What does Master Andra say to that?" Lan eyed the grinning faces flatly. "Well enough, if they remember what I've told them, for a change." Tom snorted through his moustaches. "Huh, these country folk loose in a city." He snorted again and shook his head. With the crowding at the inn, there were only 3 rooms to be had, 1 for Moraine and Egwene, and 2 to take the men. Rand found himself sharing with Lan and Tom on the 4th floor at the back, close up under the overhanging eaves, with a single small window that overlooked the stable yard. Full night had fallen, and light from the inn made a pool outside. It was a small room to begin, and an extra bed set up for Tom made it smaller, though all 3 were narrow. And hard, Rand found, when he threw himself down on his. Definitely not the best room. Tom stayed only long enough to uncase his flute and harp, then left, already practicing grand poses. Lan went with him. It was strange, Rand thought as he shifted uncomfortably on the bed. A week ago he would have been downstairs like a falling rock for just the chance he might see a gleeman perform, for just the rumor of it. But he had heard Tom tell his stories every night for a week, and Tom would be there tomorrow night, and the next, and the hot bath had loosened kinks in muscles that he had thought would be there forever, and his first hot meal in a week oozed lethargy into him. Sleepily, he wondered if Lan really did know the false dragon, Loghain. A muffled shout came from below stairs, the common room greeting Tom's arrival. But Rand was already asleep. The stone hallway was dim and shadowy, and empty except for Rand. He could not tell where the light came from, what little there was of it. The grey walls were bare of candles or lamps, nothing at all to account for the faint glow that seemed to just be there.
The air was still and dank, and somewhere in the distance water dripped with a steady, hollow plonk. Wherever this was, it was not the inn. Frowning, he rubbed at his forehead. Inn. His head hurt, and thoughts were hard to hold on to. There had been something about an inn? It was gone, whatever it was. He licked his lips and wished he had something to drink. He was awfully thirsty, dry as dust thirsty. It was the dripping sound that decided him. With nothing to choose by except his thirst, he started towards that steady plonk, plonk, plonk. The hallway stretched on, without any crossing corridor and without the slightest change in appearance. The only features at all were the rough doors set at regular intervals in pairs, one on either side of the hall, the wood splintered and dry despite the damp in the air. The shadows receded ahead of him, staying the same, and the dripping never came any closer. After a long time, he decided to try one of those doors. It opened easily, and he stepped through into a grim, stone-walled chamber. One wall opened in a series of arches onto a grey stone balcony, and beyond that was a sky such as he had never seen. Striated clouds in blacks and greys, reds and oranges, streamed by as if storm winds drove them, weaving and interweaving endlessly. No one could ever have seen a sky like that. It could not exist. He pulled his eyes away from the balcony, but the rest of the room was no better. Odd curves and peculiar angles, as if the chamber had been melted almost haphazardly out of the stone, and columns that seemed to grow out of the grey floor. Flames roared on the hearth like a forge fire with the bellows pumping, but gave no heat. Strange oval stones made the fireplace. They just looked like stones, wet slick despite the fire, when he looked straight at them. But when he glimpsed them from the corner of his eye, they seemed to be faces instead. The faces of men and women writhing in anguish, screaming silently. The high-backed chairs and the polished table in the middle of the room were perfectly ordinary, but that in itself emphasized the rest. A single mirror hung on the wall, but that was not ordinary at all. When he looked at it, he saw only a blur where his reflection should have been. Everything else in the room was shown true, but not him. A man stood in front of the fireplace. He had not noticed the man when he first came in. If he had not known it was impossible, he would have said no one had been there until he actually looked at the man. Dressed in dark clothes of a fine cut, he seemed in the prime of his maturity, and Rand supposed women would have found him good-looking. "Once more we meet face to face," the man said, and just for an instant his mouth and eyes became openings into endless caverns of flame. With a yell, Rand hurled himself backwards out of the room, so hard that he stumbled across the hall and banged into the door there, knocking it open. He twisted and grabbed at the door handle to keep from falling to the floor, and found himself staring wide-eyed into a stone room with an impossible sky through the arches leading to a balcony and a fireplace. "You cannot get away from me that easily," the man said. Rand twisted, scrambling back out of the room, trying to regain his feet without slowing down. This time there was no corridor. He froze, half-crouched, not far from the polished table, and looked at the man by the fireplace. It was better than looking at the fireplace stones, or at the sky. "This is a dream," he said as he straightened. Behind him he heard the click of the door closing. "It's some kind of nightmare." He shut his eyes, thinking about waking up. When he was a child, the wisdom had said if you could do that in a nightmare, it would go away. The wisdom? What? If only his thoughts would stop sliding away, if only his head would stop hurting, then he could think straight. He opened his eyes again. The room was still as it had been. The balcony, the sky, the man by the fireplace. "Is it a dream?" the man said. "Does it matter?" Once again, for a moment, His mouth and eyes became peepholes into a furnace that seemed to stretch forever. His voice did not change. He did not seem to notice it happening at all. Rand jumped a little this time, but he managed to keep from yelling. This is a dream. It has to be. All the same, he stepped backwards all the way to the door, never taking his eyes off the fellow by the fire, and tried the handle. It did not move. The door was locked. "You seem thirsty," the man by the fire said. "Drink." On the table was a goblet, shining gold and ornamented with rubies and amethysts. It had not been there before. He wished he could stop jumping. It was only a dream. His mouth felt like dust. "I am a little," he said, picking up the goblet. The man leaned forward intently, one hand on the back of a chair, watching him. The smell of spiced wine drove home to Rand just how thirsty he was, as if he had nothing to drink in days. "Have I?" With the wine halfway to his mouth, he stopped. Whispers of smoke were rising from the chair back between the man's fingers, and those eyes watched him so sharply, flickering rapidly in and out of flames. Rand licked his lips and put the wine back on the table, untasted. "I'm not as thirsty as I thought." The man straightened abruptly, his face without expression. His disappointment could not have been more plain if he had cursed. Rand wondered what was in the wine. But that was a stupid question, of course. This was all a dream. Then why won't it stop? "What do you want?" he demanded. "Who are you?" Flames rose in the man's eyes and mouth. Rand thought he could hear them roar. "Some call me Baalzamon." Rand found himself facing the door, jerking frantically at the handle. All thought of dreams had vanished. The Dark One. The door handle would not budge, but he kept twisting. "Are you the one?" Baalzamon said suddenly. "You cannot hide it from me forever. You cannot even hide yourself from me. Not on the highest mountain or in the deepest cave. I know you, down to the smallest hair." Rand turned to face the man, to face Baalzamon. He swallowed hard. A nightmare. He reached back to give the door handle one last pull, then stood up straighter. "Are you expecting glory?" Baalzamon said. "Power? Did they tell you the eye of the world would serve you? What glory or power is there for a puppet? The strings that move you have been centuries weaving. Your father was chosen by the White Tower, like a stallion roped and led to his business. Your mother was no more than a brood mare to their plans, and those plans lead to your death." Rand's hands knotted in fists. "My father is a good man. Then my mother was a good woman. Don't you talk about them." The flames laughed. "So there is some spirit in you after all. Perhaps you are the one. Little good it will do you. The Amelin seat will use you until you are consumed, just as Davian was used, and Yorian Stonebow, and Gwaira Amalasin, and Raoulin Darksbane. Just as Loghain is being used. Used until there is nothing left of you." "I don't know." Rand swung his head from side to side. The one moment of clear thinking, born in anger, was gone. Even as he groped for it again, he could not remember how he had reached it the first time. His thoughts spun around and around. He seized one like a raft in the whirlpool. He forced the words out, his voice strengthening the further he went. "You are bound in Sheol Ghul. You and all the Forsaken. Bound by the Creator until the end of time." "The end of time," Baalzamon mocked. "You live like a beetle under a rock, and you think your slime is the universe. The death of time will bring me power such as you could not dream of, worm. You are bound." "Fool, I have never been bound." The fires of his face roared so hot that Rand stepped back, sheltering behind his hands. The sweat on his palms dried from the heat. "I stood at Lews Therin Kinslayer's shoulder when he did the deed that named him.
It was I who told him to kill his wife and his children and all his blood and every living person who loved him or whom he loved. It was I who gave him the moment of sanity to know what he had done. Have you ever heard a man scream his soul away, worm? He could have struck at me then. He could not have won, but he could have tried. Instead, he called down his precious one power upon himself, so much that the earth split open and reared up Dragon Mount to mark his tomb. 1,000 years later, I sent the Trollocs ravening south, and for 3 centuries they savaged the world. Those blind fools in Tarvalon said I was beaten in the end, but the Second Covenant, the Covenant of the 10 Nations, was shattered beyond remaking, and who was left to oppose me then? I whispered in Arthur Hawkwing's ear, and the length and breadth of the land, Aes Sedai, died. I whispered again, and the High King sent his armies across the Arid Ocean, across the World Sea, and sealed 2 dooms. The doom of his dream of one land and one people, and a doom yet to come. At his deathbed, I was there when his counselors told him only Aes Sedai could save his life. I spoke, and he ordered his counselors to the stake. I spoke, and the High King's last words were to cry that Tarvalon must be destroyed. When men such as these could not stand against me, what chance do you have, a toad crouching beside a forest puddle? You will serve me, or you will dance on Aes Sedai strings until you die. And then you will be mine. The dead belong to me. No, Rand muttered. This is a dream. It is a dream. Do you think you are safe from me in your dreams? Look! Ba'alzamon pointed commandingly, and Rand's head turned to follow, although he did not turn it. He did not want to turn. The goblet was gone from the table. Where it had been crouched a large rat, blinking at the light, sniffing the air warily. Ba'alzamon crooked his finger, and with a squeak, the rat arched its back, forepaws lifting into the air while it balanced awkwardly on its hind feet. The finger curved more, and the rat toppled over, scrabbling frantically, pawing at nothing, squealing shrilly, its back bending, bending, bending. With a sharp snap, like the breaking of a twig, the rat trembled violently and was still, lying bent almost double. Rand swallowed. Anything can happen in a dream, he mumbled. Without looking, he swung his fist back against the door again. His hand hurt, but he still did not wake up. Then go to the Aes Sedai. Go to the White Tower and tell them. Tell the Amelin seat of this dream. The man laughed. Rand felt the heat of the flames on his face. That is one way to escape them. They will not use you then. No, not when they know that I know. But will they let you live, to spread the tale of what they do? Are you a big enough fool to believe they will? The ashes of many like you are scattered on the slopes of Dragon Mount. This is a dream, Rand said, panting. It's a dream, and I'm going to wake up. Will you? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man's finger move to point at him. Will you, indeed? The finger crooked, and Rand screamed as he arched backwards, every muscle in his body forcing him further. Will you ever wake again? Convulsively, Rand jerked up in the darkness, his hands tightening on cloth. A blanket. Pale moonlight shone through the single window. The shadowed shapes of the other 2 beds. A snore from one of them, like canvas ripping. Tom Merrilin. A few coals gleamed among the ashes on the hearth. It had been a dream then, like that nightmare in the Winespring Inn the day of Beltane. Everything that he had heard and done all jumbled in together with old tales and nonsense from nowhere. He pulled the blanket up around his shoulders, but it was not cold that made him shake. His head hurt, too. Perhaps Moraine could do something to stop these dreams. She said she could help with nightmares. With a snort, he lay back. Were the dreams really bad enough for him to ask the help of an Aes Sedai? On the other hand, could anything he did now get him in any deeper? He had left the Two Rivers, come away with an Aes Sedai. But there had not been any choice, of course. So, did he have any choice but to trust her? An Aes Sedai? It was as bad as the dreams, thinking about it. He huddled under his blanket, trying to find the calmness of the void the way Tam had taught him. But sleep was a long time returning. Chapter 15. Strangers and Friends. Sunlight streaming across his narrow bed finally woke Rand out of a deep but restless sleep. He pulled a pillow over his head, but it did not really shut out the light, and he did not really want to go back to sleep. There had been more dreams after the first. He could not remember any but the first, but he knew he wanted no more. With a sigh, he tossed the pillow aside and sat up, wincing as he stretched. All the aches he thought had soaked out in the bath were back, and his head still hurt too. It did not surprise him. A dream like that was enough to give anybody a headache. The others had already faded, but not that one. The other beds were empty. Light poured in through the window at a steep angle. The sun stood well above the horizon. By this hour back on the farm, he would have already fixed something to eat and been well into his chores. He scrambled out of bed, muttering angrily to himself. A city to see, and they did not even wake him. At least someone had seen that there was water in the pitcher, and still warm, too. He washed and dressed quickly, hesitating a moment over Tam's sword. Lan and Tom had left their saddlebags and blanket rolls behind in the room, of course, but the warder's sword was nowhere to be seen. Lan had worn his sword in Emond's Field even before there was any hint of trouble. He thought he would take the older man's lead. Telling himself it was not because he had often daydreamed about walking the streets of a real city wearing a sword, he belted it on and tossed his cloak over his shoulder like a sack. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, he hurried down to the kitchen. That was surely the quickest place to get a bite, and on his only day in Baerlon, he did not want to waste any more time than he already had. Blood and ashes, but they could have waked me. Master Fitch was in the kitchen, confronting a plump woman whose arms were covered in flour to her elbows, obviously the cook. Rather, she was confronting him, shaking her finger under his nose. Serving maids and scullions, potboys and spitboys hurried about their tasks, elaborately ignoring what was going on in front of them. "My Kiri is a good cat," the cook was saying sharply, "and I won't hear a word otherwise, do you hear? Complaining about him doing his job too well, that's what you're doing if you ask me." "I've had complaints," Master Fitch managed to get in. "Complaints, mistress. Half the guests." "I won't hear of it. I just won't hear of it. If they want to complain about my cat, let them do the cooking. My poor old cat is just doing his job, and me, we'll go somewhere where we're appreciated. See if we don't." She untied her apron and started to lift it over her head. "No!" Master Fitch yelped and leaped to stop her. They danced in a circle, with the cook trying to take her apron off and the innkeeper trying to put it back on her. "No, Sarah," he panted. "There's no need for this. No need, I say. What would I do without you? Kiri's a fine cat, an excellent cat. He's the best cat in Baerlon. If anyone else complains, I'll tell them to be thankful the cat is doing his job. Yes, thankful. You mustn't go. Sarah! Sarah!" The cook stopped their circling and managed to snatch her apron free of him. "All right, then. All right." Clutching the apron in both hands, she still did not retie it. "But if you expect me to have anything ready for midday, you'd better get out of here and let me get to it. This may be your inn, but it's my kitchen. Unless you want to do the cooking." She made as if to hand the apron to him. Master Fitch stepped back with his hands spread wide. He opened his mouth, then stopped, looking around for the first time. The kitchen help still studiously ignored the cook and the innkeeper, and Rand began an intensive search of his coat pockets, though, except for the coin Moraine had given him, there was nothing in them but a few coppers and a handful of odds and ends. His pocket knife and sharpening stone, 2 spare bowstrings, and a piece of string he had thought might be useful. I am sure, Sarah, Master Fitch said carefully, that everything will be up to your usual excellence. With that, he took one last suspicious look at the kitchen help, then left with as much dignity as he could manage. Sarah waited until he was gone before briskly tying her apron strings again, then fastened her eye on Rand. I suppose you want something to eat, eh? Well, come on in. She gave him a quick grin. I don't bite. I don't. No matter what you may have seen as you shouldn't. Keel, get the lads some bread and cheese and milk. That's all there is right now. Sit yourself, lad. Your friends have all gone out, except one lad I understand wasn't feeling well, and I expect you'll be wanting to do the same. One of the serving maids brought a tray while Rand took a stool at the table. He began eating as the cook went back to kneading her bread dough, but she was not finished talking. You mustn't take any mind of what you saw now. Master Fitch is a good enough man, though the best of you aren't any bargains. It's the folk complaining as has him on edge. And what do they have to complain about? Would they rather find live rats than dead ones? Though it isn't like Carey to leave his handiwork behind. And over a dozen. Carey wouldn't let so many get into the inn. He wouldn't. It's a clean place too, and not one to be so troubled. And all with backs broken. She shook her head at the strangeness of it all. The bread and cheese turned to ashes in Rand's mouth. Their backs were broken. The cook waved a floury hand. Think on happier things, that's my way of looking. There's a gleeman, you know, in the common room right this minute. Ah, but then you came with him, didn't you? You're one of those as came with Mistress Alice last evening, aren't you? I thought you were. I won't get much chance to see this gleeman myself, I'm thinking. Not with the inn as full as it is, and most of them riffraff down from the mines. She gave the dough an especially heavy thump. Not the sort we'd let in most times, only the whole town is filled up with them. Better than some they could be, though, I suppose. Why, I haven't seen a gleeman since before the winter, and... Rand ate mechanically, not tasting anything, not listening to what the cook said. Dead rats with their backs broken. He finished his breakfast hastily, stammered his thanks, and hurried out. He had to talk to someone. The common room of the Stag and Lion shared little except its purpose with the same room at the Winespring Inn. It was twice as wide and 3 times as long, and colourful pictures of ornate buildings with gardens of tall trees and bright flowers were painted high on the walls. Instead of one huge fireplace, a hearth blazed on each wall, and scores of tables filled the floor, with almost every chair, bench or stool taken. Every man among the crowd of patrons with pipes in their teeth and mugs in their fists leaned forward with his attention on one thing. Tom, standing atop a table in the middle of the room, his many-coloured cloak tossed over a nearby chair. Even Master Fitch held a silver tankard and a polishing cloth in motionless hands. Prancing silver hooves and proud arched necks, Tom proclaimed, while somehow seeming not only to be riding a horse, but to be one of a long procession of riders. Silken manes flutter with tossed heads. 1,000 streaming banners whip rainbows against an endless sky. 100 brazen-throated trumpets shiver the air, and drums rattle like thunder. Wave on wave, cheers roll from watches in their thousands, roll across the rooftops and towers of Ilion, crash and break unheard around the 1,000 ears of riders whose eyes and hearts shine with their sacred quest. The great Hunt of the Horn rides forth, rides to seek the Horn of Balir that will summon the heroes of the ages back from the grave to battle for the light. It was what the gleeman had called plain chant those nights beside the fire on the ride north. Stories, he said, were told in 3 voices: high chant, plain chant, and common, which meant simply telling it the way you might tell your neighbour about your crop. Tom told stories in common, but he did not bother to hide his contempt for the voice. Rand closed the door without going in and slumped against the wall. He would get no advice from Tom. Moraine. What would she do if she knew? He became aware of people staring at him as they passed and realized he was muttering under his breath. Smoothing his coat, he straightened. He had to talk to somebody. The cook had said one of the others had not gone out. It was an effort not to run. When he rapped on the door of the room where the other boys had slept and poked his head in, only Perrin was there, lying on his bed and still not dressed. He twisted his head on the pillow to look at Rand, then closed his eyes again. Matt's bow and quiver were propped in the corner. "I heard you weren't feeling well," Rand said. He came in and sat on the next bed. "I just wanted to talk. He did not know how to bring it up," he realized. "If you're sick," he said, half standing, "maybe you ought to sleep. I can go. I don't know if I'll ever sleep again." Perrin sighed. "I had a bad dream, if you must know, and couldn't get back to sleep. Matt will be quick enough to tell you. He laughed this morning when I told them why I was too tired to go out with him. But he dreamed too. I listened to him for most of the night, tossing and muttering, and you can't tell me he got a good night's sleep." He threw a thick arm across his eyes. "Light, but I'm tired. Maybe if I just stay here for an hour or two, I'll feel like getting up. Matt will never let me hear the end of it if I miss seeing Bearlon because of a dream." Rand slowly lowered himself to the bed again. He licked his lips, then said quickly, "Did he kill a rat?" Perrin lowered his arm and stared at him. "You too," he said finally. When Rand nodded, he said, "I wish I was back home. He told me. He said, what are we going to do?" "Have you told Moraine?" "No, not yet. Maybe I won't. I don't know. What about you?" He said, "Blood and ashes, Rand. I don't know." Perrin raised up on his elbow abruptly. "Do you think Matt had the same dream? He laughed, but it sounded forced, and he looked funny when I said I couldn't sleep because of a dream." "Maybe he did," Rand said. Guiltily, he felt relieved he was not the only one. "I was going to ask Tom for advice. He's seen a lot of the world. You don't think we should tell Moraine, do you?" Perrin fell back on his pillow. "You've heard the stories about Aes Sedai. Do you think we can trust Tom? If we can trust anybody?" "Rand, if we get out of this alive, if we ever get back home, and you hear me say anything about leaving Emmons Field, even to go as far as Watch Hill, you kick me, all right?" "That's no way to talk," Rand said. He put on a smile, as cheerful as he could make it. "Of course we'll get home. Come on, get up. We're in a city, and we have a whole day to see it. Where are your clothes?" Hugo lay there with his eyes covered and did not say a word. After a minute, Rand stepped out and closed the door behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, his smile fading. His head still hurt.
I apologize.
It was worse,
for you seeing
not
my
better.
ugly face. I was not prepared.
He could not work up much enthusiasm for Bearlon either. Not now. He could not summon enthusiasm about anything. A chambermaid came by, her arms full of sheets, and gave him a concerned look. Before she could speak, he moved off down the hall, shrugging into his cloak. Tom would not be finished in the common room for hours yet. He might as well see what he could. Perhaps he could find Matt, and see if Baal had been in his dreams too. He went downstairs, more slowly this time, rubbing his temple. The stairs ended near the kitchen, so he took that way out, nodding to Sarah but hurrying on when she seemed about to take up where she had left off. The stable yard was empty, except for Much, standing in the stable door, and one of the other ostlers carrying a sack on his shoulder into the stable. Rand nodded to Much, too, but the stableman gave him a truculent look and went inside. He hoped the rest of the city was more like Sarah, and less like Much. Ready to see what a city was like, he picked up his step. At the open stable yard gates, he stopped and stared. People packed the street like sheep in a pen. People swathed to the eyes in cloaks and coats, hats pulled down against the cold, weaving in and out at a quick step, as though the wind whistling over the rooftops blew them along, elbowing past one another with barely a word or a glance. All strangers, he thought. None of them know each other. The smells were strange, too. Sharp and sour and sweet, all mixed in a hodgepodge that had him rubbing his nose. Even at the height of festival, he had never seen so many people so jammed together. Not even half so many, and this was only one street. Master Fitch and the cook said the whole city was full. The whole city like this? He backed slowly away from the gate, away from the street full of people. It really was not right to go off and leave Perrin sick in bed. And what if Tom finished his storytelling while Rand was off in the city? The Gleeman might go out himself, and Rand needed to talk to someone. Much better to wait a bit. He breathed a sigh of relief as he turned his back on the swarming street. Going back inside the inn did not appeal to him, though. Not with his headache. He sat on an upended barrel against the back of the inn and hoped the cold air might help his head. Much came to the stable door from time to time to stare at him, and even across the stable yard he could make out the fellow's disapproving scowl. Was it country people the man did not like? Or had he been embarrassed by Master Fitch greeting them after he had tried to chase them off for coming in the back way? Maybe he's a dark friend, he thought, expecting to chuckle at the idea, but it was not a funny thought. He rubbed his hand along the hilt of Tam's sword. There was not much left that was funny at all. "A shepherd with a Heramark sword," said a low woman's voice. "That's almost enough to make me believe anything. What trouble are you in, Dan Country Boy?" Startled, Rand jumped to his feet. It was the crop-haired young woman who had been with Moraine when he came out of the bath chamber, still dressed in a boy's coat and breeches. She was a little older than he was, he thought, with dark eyes even bigger than Egwene's, and oddly intent. "You're Rand, aren't you?" she went on. "My name's Min." "I'm not in trouble," he said. He did not know what Moraine had told her, but he remembered Lan's admonition not to attract any notice. "What makes you think I'm in trouble? The Two Rivers is a quiet place, and we're all quiet people. No place for trouble, unless it has to do with crops or sheep." "Quiet?" Min said with a faint smile. "I've heard men talk about you Two Rivers folk. I've heard the jokes about wooden-headed sheep herders, and then there are men who have actually been down country." "Wooden-headed?" Rand said, frowning. "What jokes?" "The ones who know," she went on as if he had not spoken. "So you walk around all smiles and politeness, just as meek and soft as butter. On the surface, anyway. Underneath, they say, you're all as tough as old oak roots. Prod too hard, they say, and you dig up stone. But the stone isn't very, very deep in you, or in your friends. It's as if a storm has scoured away almost all the covering. Moraine didn't tell me everything, but I see what I see." Old oak roots? Stone? It hardly sounded like the sort of thing the merchants or their people would say. That last made him jump, though. He looked around quickly. The stable yard was empty, and the nearest windows were closed. "I don't know anybody named... What was it again?" "Mistress Alice, then, if you prefer," Min said with an amused look that made his cheeks colour. "There's no one close enough to hear." "What makes you think Mistress Alice has another name?" "Because she told me," Min said, so patiently that he blushed again. "Not that she had a choice, I suppose. I saw she was... different. Right away, when she stopped here before, on her way down country. She knew about me. I've talked to... others like her before." "Saw?" Rand said. "Well, I don't suppose you'll go running to the children. Not considering who your travelling companions are. The White Cloaks wouldn't like what I do any more than they like what she does." "I don't understand." "She says I see pictures of the pattern." Min gave a little laugh and shook her head. "It sounds too grand to me. I just see things when I look at people. And sometimes I know what they mean. I look at a man and a woman who've never even talked to one another and I'll know they'll marry. And they do. That sort of thing. She wanted me to look at you. All of you together." Rand shivered. "And what did you see?" "When you're all in a group, sparks swirling around you, thousands of them, and a big shadow, darker than midnight. It's so strong I almost wonder why everybody can't see it. The sparks are trying to fill the shadow, and the shadow is trying to swallow the sparks." She shrugged. "You're all tied together in something dangerous, but I can't make any more of it." "All of us?" Rand muttered. "Egwene, too, but they weren't after... I mean..." Min did not seem to notice his slip. "The girl? Yes, she's part of it. And the Gleeman. All of you. You're in love with her." He stared at her. "I can tell that, even without seeing any images. She loves you too.
But she's not for you, or you for her. Not the way you both want. What's that supposed to mean? When I look at her, I see the same as when I look at Mistress Alice. Other things I don't understand too, but I know what that means. She won't refuse it. This is all foolishness, Rand said uncomfortably. His headache was fading to numbness. His head felt packed with wool. He wanted to get away from this girl and the things she saw. And yet, what do you see when you look at the rest of us? All sorts of things, Min said with a grin as if she knew what he really wanted to ask. Master Andra has 7 ruined towers around his head, and a babe in a cradle holding a sword, and... She shook her head. Men like him, you understand, always have so many images they crowd one another. The strongest images around the Gleeman are a man, not him, juggling fire, and the White Tower, and that doesn't make any sense at all for a man. The strongest things I see about the big curly-haired fellow are a wolf, and a broken crown, and trees flowering all around him. And the other one, a red eagle, an eye on a balance scale, a dagger with a ruby, a horn, and a laughing face. There are other things, but you see what I mean. This time I can't make up or down out of any of it. She waited then, still grinning, until he finally cleared his throat and asked, "What about me?" Her grin stopped just short of outright laughter. The same kind of things as the rest. A sword that isn't a sword, a golden crown of laurel leaves, a baked staff, you pouring water on sand, a bloody hand, and a white-hot iron, 3 women standing over a funeral bier with you on it, black rock wet with blood. All right, he broke in uneasily. You don't have to list it all. Most of all, I see lightning around you, some striking at you, some coming out of you. I don't know what any of it means, except for one thing. You and I will meet again. She gave him a quizzical look, as if she did not understand that either. Why shouldn't we? He said. I'll be coming back this way on my way home. I suppose you will at that. Suddenly her grin was back, wry and mysterious, and she patted his cheek. But if I told you everything I saw, you'd be as curly-haired as your friend with the shoulders. He jerked back from her hand as if it were red hot. What do you mean? Do you see anything about rats? Or dreams? Rats? No, not rats. As for dreams, well, maybe it's your idea of a dream, but I never thought it was mine. He wondered if she was crazy, grinning like that. I have to go, he said, edging around her. I have to meet my friends. Go then. But you won't escape. He didn't exactly break into a run, but every step he took was quicker than the step before. Run if you want, she called after him. You can't escape from me. Her laughter sped him across the stable yard and out into the street, into the hubbub of people. Her last words were too close to what Baalzamon had said. He blundered into people as he hurried through the crowd, earning hard looks and hard words, but he did not slow down until he was several streets away from the inn. After a time, he began to pay attention again to where he was. His head felt like a balloon, but he stared and enjoyed anyway. He thought Baerlon was a grand city, if not exactly in the same way as cities in Tom's stories. He wandered up broad streets, most paved with flagstone, and down narrow, twisting lanes, wherever chance and the shifting of the crowd took him. It had rained during the night, and the streets that were unpaved had already been churned to mud by the crowds, but muddy streets were nothing new to him. None of the streets in Emmons Field was paved. There certainly were no palaces, and only a few houses were very much bigger than those back home, but every house had a roof of slate or tile as fine as the roof of the Winespring Inn.
I am an unprofessional.
He supposed there would be a palace or two in Cayman.
I'm sorry.
As for inns, he counted 9, not one smaller than the Winespring,
Don't worry, the
and most
rest
as
of
large
these are
as
going
the
to be
Stag and
better.
Lion, and there were plenty of streets he had not seen yet.
Sorry for interrupting.
Shops dotted every street, with awnings out front sheltering tables covered with goods, everything from cloth to books to pots to boots. It was as if 100 peddlers' wagons had spilled out their contents. He stared so much that more than once he had to hurry on at the suspicious look of a shopkeeper. He had not understood the first shopkeeper's stare. When he did understand, he started to get angry until he remembered that here he was the stranger.
Yeah.
He could not have bought much anyway. He gasped when he saw how many coppers were exchanged for a dozen discoloured apples or a handful of shriveled turnips, the sort that would be fed to the horses in the two rivers. But people seemed eager to pay. There were certainly more than enough people, to his estimation. For a while, the sheer number of them almost overwhelmed him. Some wore clothes of finer cut than anyone in the two rivers, almost as fine as Moraine's, and quite a few had long, fur-lined coats that flapped around their ankles. The miners everybody at the inn kept talking about, they had the hunched look of men who grubbed underground. But most of the people did not look any different from those he had grown up with, not in dress or in face. He had expected they would, somehow. Indeed, some of them had so much the look of the two rivers in their faces that he could imagine they belonged to one family or another that he knew around Emmons Field. A toothless, grey-haired fellow with ears like jug handles sitting on a bench outside one of the inns and peering mournfully into an empty tankard could easily have been Billy Conger's close cousin. The lantern-jawed tailor sewing in front of his shop might have been John Thane's brother, even to the same bald spot on the back of his head. A near mirror image of Samuel Crawl pushed past Rand as he turned a corner and, in disbelief, he stared at a bony little man with long arms and a big nose, shoving hurriedly through the crowd in clothes that looked like a bundle of rags. The man's eyes were sunken and his dirty face gaunt as if he had not eaten or slept in days, but Rand could swear. The ragged man saw him then and froze in mid-step, heedless of people who all but stumbled over him. The last doubt in Rand's mind vanished. "Master Fane!" he shouted. "We all thought you were—" As quick as a blink, the peddler darted away, but Rand dodged after him, calling apologies over his shoulder to the people he bumped. Through the crowd, he just caught sight of Fane dashing into an alleyway, and he turned after. A few steps into the alleyway, the peddler had stopped in his tracks. A tall fence made it into a dead end. As Rand skidded to a halt, Fane rounded on him, crouching warily and backing away. He flapped grimy hands at Rand to stay back. More than one rip showed in his coat, and his cloak was worn and tattered as if it had seen much harder use than it was meant for. "Master Fane?" Rand said hesitantly. "What is the matter?" "It's me, Randall Thor from Emmons Field. We all thought the Trollocs had taken you." Fane gestured sharply and, still in a crouch, ran a few crabbed steps toward the open end of the alley. He did not try to pass Rand, or even come close to him. "Don't!" he rasped. His head shifted constantly as he tried to see everything in the street beyond Rand. "Don't mention!" His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, and he turned his head away, watching Rand with quick, sidelong glances. "Them! There be white cloaks in the town." "Well, they have no reason to bother us," Rand said. "Come back to the Stag and Lion with me. I'm staying there with friends. You know most of them. They'll be glad to see you. We all thought you were dead." "Dead?" the peddler snapped indignantly. "Not Pattern Fane. Pattern Fane knows which way to jump and where to land." He straightened his rags as if they were feast day clothes. "Always have and always will. I'll live a long time. Longer than—" Abruptly his face tightened and his hands clutched hold of his coat front. "They burned my wagon and all my goods. Had no cause to be doing that, did they? I couldn't get to my horses. My horses, but that fat old innkeeper had them locked up in his stable. I had to step quick not to get my throat slit. And what did it get me? All that I've got left is what I stand up in. Now, is that fair? Is it now? Your horses are safe in Master Alvir's stable. You can get them any time. If you come to the inn with me, I'm sure Moraine will help you get back to the two rivers." "Ah, she's the Aes Sedai, is she?" A guarded look came over Fane's face. "Maybe, though." He paused, licking his lips nervously. "How long will you be at this? What was it? What did you call it? The Stag and Lion?" "We leave tomorrow," Rand said. "But what does that have to do with—" You just don't know." Fane whined. "Standing there with a full belly and a good night's sleep in a soft bed. I've hardly slept a wink since that night. My boots are all worn out with running. And as for what I've had to eat..."
That was stupid, Rand.
His face twisted. "I don't want to be within miles of an Aes Sedai." He spat the last words. "Not miles and miles, but I may have to. I've no choice, have I? The thought of her eyes on me, of her even knowing where I am." He reached toward Rand as if he wanted to grab his coat, but his hand stopped short, fluttering, and he actually took a step back. Promise me you won't tell her. She frightens me. There's no need to be telling her. No reason for an Aes Sedai to even be knowing I'm alive. You have to promise. You have to. I promise, Rand said soothingly. But there's no reason for you to be afraid of her. Come with me. The least you'll get is a hot meal. Maybe. Maybe. Thane rubbed his chin pensively. Tomorrow, you say? In that time, you won't forget your promise. You won't be letting her... I won't let her hurt you, Rand said, wondering how he could stop an Aes Sedai, whatever she wanted to do. She won't hurt me, Thane said. No, she won't. I won't be letting her. Like a flash, he hurried past Rand into the crowd. Master Thane! Rand called. Wait! He dashed out of the alley just in time to catch sight of a ragged coat disappearing around the next corner. Still calling, he ran after it, darted around the corner. He only had time to see a man's back before he crashed into it and they both went down in a heap in the mud. Can't you watch where you're going? Came a mutter from under him, and Rand scrambled up in surprise. Matt? Matt sat up with a baleful glare and began scraping mud off his cloak with his hands. You must really be turning into a city man. Sleep all morning and run right over people. Climbing to his feet, he stared at his muddy hands, then muttered and wiped them off on his cloak. Listen, you'll never guess who I thought I just saw. Padan Thane, Rand said. Padan Thane! How did you know? I was talking to him, but he ran off. So the Matt stopped to look around warily, but the crowd was passing them by with never a glance. Rand was glad he had learned a little caution. So they didn't get him. I wonder why he left Emmons Field without a word like that. Probably started running then too. Didn't stop until he got here. But why was he running just now? Rand shook his head and wished he had not. It felt as though it might fall off. I don't know, except that he's afraid of Mistress Alice. All this watching what you said was not easy. He doesn't want her to know he's here. He made me promise I wouldn't tell her. Well, his secret's safe with me, Matt said. I wish she didn't know where I was either. Matt? People still streamed by without paying them any heed, but Rand lowered his voice anyway and leaned closer. Matt, did you have a nightmare last night? About a man who killed a rat? Matt stared at him without blinking. You too, he said finally. And Perrin, I suppose. I almost asked him this morning, but... I must have. Blood and ashes. Now somebody's making us dream things, Rand. I wish nobody knew where I was. There were dead rats all over the inn this morning. He did not feel as afraid at saying it as he would have earlier. He did not feel much of anything. Their backs were broken. His voice rang in his own ears. If he was getting sick, he might have to go to Moraine. He was surprised that even the thought of the one power being used on him did not bother him. Matt took a deep breath, hitching his cloak, and looked around as if searching for somewhere to go. What's happening to us, Rand? What? I don't know. I'm going to ask Tom for advice about whether to tell anyone else. No, not her. Maybe him. But not her. The sharpness of it took Rand by surprise. Then you believed him. He did not need to say which him he meant. The grimace on Matt's face said he understood. No, Matt said slowly. It's the chances, that's all. If we tell her, and he was lying, then maybe nothing happens. Maybe. But maybe just him being in our dreams is enough for... I don't know. He stopped to swallow. If we don't tell her, maybe we'll have some more dreams. Rats or no rats, dreams are better than... Remember the ferry? I say we keep quiet. All right. Rand remembered the ferry, and Moraine's threat, too. But somehow it seemed a long time ago. All right. Perrin won't say anything, will he? Matt went on, bouncing on his toes. We have to get back to him. If he tells us, she'll figure it out about all of us. You can bet on it. Come on. He started off briskly through the crowd. Rand stood there looking after him until Matt came back and grabbed him. At the touch on his arm, he blinked, then followed his friend. "What's the matter with you?" Matt asked. "You going to sleep again?" "I think I have a cold," Rand said. His head was as tight as a drum, and almost as empty. "You can get some chicken soup when we get back to the inn," Matt said. He kept up a constant chatter as they hunted through the packed streets. Rand made an effort to listen, and even to say something now and then, but it was an effort. He was not tired. He did not want to sleep. He just felt as if he were drifting. After a while, he found himself telling Matt about Min. "A dagger with a ruby, eh?" Matt said. "I like that. I don't know about the eye, though. You sure she wasn't making it up? It seems to me she would know what it all means if she really is a soothsayer." "She didn't say she was a soothsayer," Rand said. "I believe she does see things. Remember, Moraine was talking to her when we finished our baths, and she knows who Moraine is." Matt frowned at him. "Oh, I thought we weren't supposed to use that name?" "No," Rand muttered. He rubbed his head with both hands. It was so hard to concentrate on anything. "I think maybe you really are sick," Matt said, still frowning. Suddenly he pulled Rand to a stop by his coat sleeve. "Look at them." 3 men in breastplates and conical steel caps, burnished till they shone like silver, were making their way down the street toward Rand and Matt. Even the mail on their arms gleamed. Their long cloaks, pristine white and embroidered on the left breast with a golden sunburst, just cleared the mud and puddles of the street. Their hands rested on their sword hilts, and they looked around them as if looking at things that had wriggled out from under a rotting log. Nobody looked back, though. Nobody even seemed to notice them. Just the same, the 3 did not have to push through the crowd. The bustle parted to either side of the white-cloaked men as if by happenstance, leaving them to walk in a clear space that moved with them. "Do you suppose they're children of the light?" Matt asked in a loud voice. A passerby looked hard at Matt, then quickened his pace. Rand nodded. Children of the light. White cloaks. Men who hated Aes Sedai. Men who told people how to live, causing trouble for those who refused to obey. If burned farms, and worse, could be called as mild as trouble. I should be afraid, he thought. Or curious. Something at any rate. Instead, he stared at them passively. "They don't look like so much to me," Matt said. "Full of themselves, though, aren't they?" "They don't matter," Rand said. "The inn. We have to talk to Perrin." "Like you would Conga. He always has his nose in the air, too." Suddenly Matt grinned, a twinkle in his eye. "Remember when he fell off the wagon bridge and had to tramp home dripping wet? That took him down a peg for a month." "What does that have to do with Perrin?" "See that?" Matt pointed to a cart resting on its shafts in an alleyway just ahead of the children. A single stake held a dozen stacked barrels in place on the flat bed. "Watch." Laughing, he darted into a cutler's shop to their left. Rand stared after him, knowing he should do something. That look in Matt's eyes always meant one of his tricks. But oddly, he found himself looking forward to whatever Matt was going to do. Something told him that feeling was wrong, that it was dangerous, but he smiled in anticipation anyway. In a minute, Matt appeared above him, climbing half out of an attic window onto the tile roof of the shop. His sling was in his hands, already beginning to whirl. Rand's eyes went back to the cart. Almost immediately, there was a sharp crack, and the stake holding the barrels, mud and muddy water in every direction. The 3 children jumped no less quickly than anyone else, their superior looks replaced by surprise. Some passers-by fell
so
down,
sorry.
making more splashes, but the 3 moved agilely,
I
avoiding the barrels
apologize,
with ease.
everybody.
They could not avoid the flying mud that splattered their white
All I'm
cloaks,
trying to
though.
do is see how much charge I have left. My phone's about to
A
die.
bearded man in a long apron hurried out of the alley,
sorry.
waving his arms and shouting angrily. But one look at the 3 trying vainly to shake the mud from their cloaks, and he vanished back into the alley even faster than he had come out.
I have 17% of my
Rand
phone.
glanced up at the shop roof.
14 minutes
Matt was
left.
gone. It had been an easy shot for any Two Rivers lad, but the effect was certainly all that could be hoped for. He could not help laughing. The humor seemed to be wrapped in wool, but it was still funny. When he turned back to the street, the 3 white cloaks were staring straight at him. "You find something funny, yes?" The one who spoke stood a little in front of the others. He wore an arrogant, unblinking look, with a light in his eyes as if he knew something important, something no one else knew. Rand's laughter cut off short. He and the children were alone with the mud and the barrels. The crowd that had been all around them had found urgent business up or down the street. Does fear of the light hold your tongue? Anger made the white cloak's narrow face seem even more pinched. He glanced dismissively at the sword hilt sticking out from Rand's cloak. Perhaps you are responsible for this, yes? Unlike the others, he had a golden knot beneath the sunburst on his cloak. Rand moved to cover the sword, but instead swept his cloak back over his shoulder. In the back of his head was a frantic wonder at what he was doing, but it was a distant thought. Accidents happen, he said, even to the children of the light. The narrow-faced man raised an eyebrow. You are that dangerous, youngling. He was not much older than Rand. Herrenmark, Lord Bornhold, one of the others said warningly. The narrow-faced man glanced at Rand's sword hilt again. The bronze heron was plain, and his eyes widened momentarily. Then his gaze rose to Rand's face, and he sniffed dismissively. He is too young. You are not from this place, yes? He said coldly to Rand. You come from where? I'd just arrived in Berlon. A tingling thrill ran along Rand's arms and legs. He felt flushed, almost warm. You wouldn't know of a good inn, would you? You avoid my questions. Bornhold snapped. What evil is in you that you do not answer me? His companions moved up to either side of him, faces hard and expressionless. Despite the mud stains on their cloaks, there was nothing funny about them now.
Man, I'm so sorry. I am not a professional.
The
I'm
heat
so
had grown to a
sorry,
fever.
everybody.
He wanted to laugh. It felt so good.
Oh my.
A small voice in his head shouted that something was wrong, but all he could think of was how full of energy he felt, nearly bursting with it. Smiling, he rocked on his heels and waited for what was going to happen. Vaguely, distantly, he wondered what it would be. The leader's face darkened. One of the others drew his sword enough for an inch of steel to show, and spoke in a
can't
voice
wait for this to be
quivering with
over.
anger. When the children of the light ask questions, you grey-eyed bumpkin, we expect answers. Or... He cut off as the narrow-faced man threw an arm across his chest. Bornhold jerked his
I
head up
hope
the
you all
street.
appreciate me doing this. I thank you
town
for
watch had
listening and
arrived.
watching. I'm
A
really
dozen men in
sorry.
round steel caps
I
and
promise
studded
I
leather
will not
jerkins
mess up
carrying
anymore.
quarterstaffs as if they knew how to use
I'm
them.
sorry.
They stood watching,
Merry Christmas.
silently, from 10 paces off. This town has lost the light, with anger.
I rewound
When
it.
the children of the light ask questions, you grey-eyed bumpkin, we expect answers. Or... He cut off as the narrow-faced man threw an arm across his chest. Bornhold jerked his head up the street. The town watch had arrived. A dozen men in round steel caps and studded leather jerkins carrying quarterstaffs as if they knew how to use them. They stood watching, silently, from 10 paces off. This town has lost the light, growled the man who had half-drawn his sword. He raised his voice to shout at the watch. Berlon stands in the shadow of the Dark One! At a gesture from Bornhold, he slammed his blade back into its scabbard. Bornhold turned his attention back to Rand. The light of knowing burned in his eyes. Dark friends do not escape us, youngling, even in a town that stands in the shadow. We will meet again. You may be sure of it. He spun on his heel and strode away, his two companions close behind, as if Rand had ceased to exist. For the moment, at least. When they reached the crowded part of the street, the same seemingly accidental pocket as before opened around them. The watchmen hesitated, eyeing Rand, then shouldered their quarterstaffs and followed the white-cloaked three. They had to push their way into the crowd, shouting, "Make way for the watch!" Few did make way, except grudgingly. Rand still rocked on his heels, waiting. The tingle was so strong that he almost quivered. He felt as if he were burning up. Matt came out of the shop, staring at him. "You aren't sick," he said finally. "You are crazy." Rand drew a deep breath, and abruptly it was all gone like a pricked bubble. He staggered as it vanished, the realization of what he had just done flooding in on him. Licking his lips, he met Matt's stare. "I think we had better go back to the inn now," he said unsteadily. "Yes," Matt said. "Yes, I think we better had." The street had begun to fill up again, and more than one passerby stared at the two boys and murmured something to a companion. Rand was sure the story would spread. A crazy man had tried to start a fight with 3 children of the light. That was something to talk about. Maybe the dreams are driving me crazy. The two lost their way several times in the haphazard streets, but after a while they fell in with Tom Merrilin, making a grand procession all by himself through the throng. The gleeman said he was out to stretch his legs and for a bit of fresh air, but whenever anyone looked twice at his colourful cloak, he would announce in a resounding voice, "I'm at the Stag and Lion tonight only." It was Matt who began disjointedly telling Tom about the dream and their worry over whether or not to tell Moraine, but Rand joined in, for there were differences in exactly how they remembered it. Or maybe each dream was a little different, he thought. The major part of the dreams was the same, though. They had not gone far in the telling before Tom started paying full attention. When Rand mentioned Ba'alzamon, the gleeman grabbed them each by a shoulder with a command to hold their tongues, raised on tiptoe to look over the heads of the crowd, then hustled them out of the press to a dead-end alley that was empty except for a few crates and a slack-ribbed yellow dog huddled out of the cold. Tom stared out at the crowd, looking for anyone stopping to listen, before turning his attention to Rand and Matt. His blue eyes bored into theirs, between flickering away to watch the mouth of the alley. "Don't ever say that name where strangers can hear." His voice was low but urgent. "Not even where a stranger might hear. It is a very dangerous name, even where children of the light are not wandering the streets." Matt snorted. "I could tell you about children of the light," he said with a wry look at Rand. Tom ignored him. "If only one of you had had this dream." He tugged at his moustache furiously. "Tell me everything you can remember about it. Every detail." He kept up his wary watch while he listened. "He named the men he said had been used," Rand said finally. He thought he had told everything else. "Guaira Amalasan, Raoul in Darksbane, Darvian," Matt added before he could go on, "and Urian Stonebow. And Logain," Rand finished. "Dangerous names," Tom muttered. His eyes seemed to drill at them even more intently than before. "Nearly as dangerous as that other, one way and another. All dead now, except for Logain. Some long dead. Raoul in Darksbane nearly 2,000 years. But dangerous just the same. Best you don't say them aloud, even when you're alone. Most people wouldn't recognize one of them, but if the wrong person overhears..." "Who were they?" Rand said. "Men," Tom murmured. "Men who shook the pillars of heaven and rocked the world on its foundations." He shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Forget about them. They are dust now." Were they used, like he said?" Matt asked. "And killed?" "You might say the White Tower killed them. You might say that." Tom's mouth tightened momentarily. Then he shook his head again. "But used? No. I cannot see that. The light knows the Amerlin seat has enough plots going, but I can't see that." Matt shivered. He said so many things. Crazy things. All that about Luz Theron Kinslayer and Arthur Hawkwing. And the Eye of the World. What in the light is that supposed to be? "A legend," the gleeman said slowly. "Maybe. As big a legend as the Horn of Valir, at least in the Borderlands. Up there, young men go hunting the Eye of the World the way young men from Ilion hunt the Horn. Maybe a legend." "What do we do, Tom?" Rand said. "Do we tell her? I don't want any more dreams like that. Maybe she could do something." "Maybe we wouldn't like what she did," Matt growled. Tom studied them, considering and stroking his moustache with a knuckle. "I say hold your peace," he said finally. "Don't tell anyone, for the time at least. You can always change your mind if you have to. But once you tell, it's done. And you're tied up worse than ever. With her. Suddenly, he straightened, his stoop almost disappearing. The other lad. You say he had the same dream? Does he have sense enough to keep his mouth shut? I think so, Rand said, at the same time that Matt said, we were going back to the inn to warn him. The lights end were not too late. Cloak flapping around his ankles, patches fluttering in the wind, Tom strode out of the alley, looking back over his shoulder without stopping. Well? Are your feet pegged to the ground? Rand and Matt hurried after him, but he did not wait for them to catch up. This time he did not pause for people who looked at his cloak, or those who hailed him as a gleeman either. He clove through the crowded streets as if they were empty, Rand and Matt half running to follow in his wake. In much less time than Rand expected, they were hurrying up to the Stag and Lion. As they started in, Perrin came speeding out, trying to throw his cloak around his shoulders as he ran. He nearly fell in his effort not to carom into them. I was coming looking for you two, he panted when he had caught his balance. Rand grabbed him by the arm. Did you tell anyone about the dream? Say that you didn't. Matt demanded. It's very important, Tom said. Perrin looked at them in confusion. No, I haven't. I didn't even get out of bed until less than an hour ago. His shoulders slumped. I've given myself a headache trying not to think about it, much less talk about it. Why did you tell him? He nodded at the gleeman. We had to talk to somebody or go crazy, Rand said. I'll explain later, Tom added with a significant look at the people passing in and out of the Stag and Lion. All right, Perrin replied slowly, still looking confused. Suddenly he slapped his head. You almost made me forget why I was looking for you. Not that I don't wish I could. Nynaeve is inside. Blood and ashes, Matt yelped. How did she get here? Moraine! The ferry! Perrin snorted. You think a little thing like a sunken ferry could stop her? She rooted Hightower out. I don't know how he got back over the river, but she said he was hiding in his bedroom and didn't want to go near the river. Anyway, she bullied him into finding a boat big enough for her and her horse and rowing her across. Himself. She only gave him time to find one of his haulers to work another set of oars. Light, Matt breathed. What is she doing here? Rand wanted to know. Matt and Perrin both gave him a scornful look. She came after us, Perrin said. She's with Mistress Alice right now, and it's cold enough in there to snow. Couldn't we just go somewhere else for a while? Matt asked. My da says only a fool puts his hand in a hornet nest until he absolutely has to. Rand cut in. She can't make us go back. Winter night should have been enough to make her see that. If she doesn't, we will have to make her. Matt's eyebrows lifted higher with every word, and when Rand finished, he let out a low whistle. You ever try to make Nynaeve see something she doesn't want to see? I have. I say we stay away till night, and sneak in then. From my observation of the young woman, Tom said, I don't think she will stop until she has had her say. If she's not allowed to have it soon, she might keep on until she attracts attention none of us wants. That brought them all up short. They exchanged glances, drew deep breaths, and marched inside as if to face Trollocs.